get ready to dim the lights and lock your doors. Friday Night Frights is here to haunt your weekend. Every Friday night, we bring you spine-chilling tales of the macabre, the mysterious, and the downright terrifying. From cursed artifacts to shadowy creatures lurking in the dark, these stories will keep you on the edge of your seat long after the episode ends. Are you brave enough to listen? Tune in and be sure to subscribe to our channel for more eerie episodes. Our story tonight is called Teeth in the River. Old Jeremiah had spent most of his life on these banks, hauling in his catch with steady hands and a quiet dignity. The river that wound lazily through the countryside had been his friend and livelihood for decades, its shimmering surface a mirror of calm, or so he had believed. One fateful morning, however, everything changed. As Jeremiah rowed his creaking skiff into the misty dawn, something in the murky water set his heart pounding like never before. At first it was only a glint, small flecks of white among the smooth, worn river rocks. He paused, brow furrowed beneath his weather-beaten cap, squinting at the rippling current. What he saw was not fish scales or stones polished by the years, but something far more macabre, human teeth. Rows of them, jagged and stained, were embedded in the riverbed. Some protruded at odd angles, as if forcefully driven in. Others lay buried beneath a thin film of silt. Shocked and disoriented, Jeremiah steadied his trembling hands on the oars. His mind raced with a primal fear he hadn't known since childhood nightmares. He pulled his skiff closer to the bank and climbed out with reluctance. The chill of early morning seeped through his thick trousers as he approached the water's edge. The sight of those teeth was ghastly, a grotesque tapestry of human remains arranged in no particular order. He dared not touch them. What kind of horror could produce such an image? Had someone sacrificed their soul here? Or was it the vengeful result of forgotten sins, hidden beneath the river's placid surface? Jeremiah's first instinct was to retreat, but the natural pull of curiosity, mingled with a desperate need for explanation, compelled him to linger. With each slow, measured step along the muddy bank, the river whispered secrets he could not quite decipher. Even as he examined the teeth from a distance, he realized that his own reflection in the dark, glassy water no longer showed a man with a face lined by years of honest labor. Instead, the river offered a horrifying sight. His reflection was mouthless, a gaping void where his lips should have been, as if the water had stolen not just his smile, but his very voice. For a long, agonizing moment, Jeremiah stood transfixed, his heartbeat echoing the rustle of water against stone, wondering if the vision was a trick of his weary eyes or a cursed omen. That night, sleep proved as elusive as the answers he sought. He lay in his narrow bed in the cramped cabin by the river, every flicker of shadow in the darkness a reminder of what he had witnessed. His dreams were invaded by silence, a crushing, suffocating silence where every unspoken word of terror vibrated in the void. And then, as he drifted toward a restless slumber, he heard it, the distant murmur of a voice, as if the river itself were speaking. Softly, almost imperceptibly at first, it called out his name, Jeremiah. The tone was mournful and hungry, a sound that pulled at the deepest recesses of his soul. When morning came, the chill in his bones had not abated. The river was still there, moving languidly beneath the sky the color of bruised wine, but something else had changed. The faces of those passing by in town were shadowed with a quiet dread. They spoke in hushed tones about what had been seen by the water. Old fishermen whispered of cursed nights when the river's surface shimmered with unholy reflections, and the teeth that lay hidden in its bed were rumored to belong to souls long lost, lured by a darkness that the river kept secret. For days after that eerie dawn, Jeremiah found that the nightmares were no longer confined to his sleep. In every reflective surface he encountered, a puddle left by a passing storm, the glass of an abandoned farmhouse window, he saw variations of that terrible image, his own face, missing its mouth, with an uncanny stillness in its eyes. There were also glimpses of countless teeth and fragments scattered in the corners of every mirror, as if the curse had spread like a slow, corrosive infection. At the local general store, a young woman gasped as she caught her reflection, and a nearby man muttered something about the river taking our voices away. No one could explain it, yet fear rippled through the town like a sudden, ominous current. Desperate for answers, Jeremiah began to collect every scrap of lore and every whispered legend about the river. He pored over yellowed newspapers, brittle diaries, and even listened to the ramblings of the town's oldest resident, Miss Alma, who claimed that the river had once been the site of a terrible massacre, a ritual sacrifice performed by shadowy figures in the deep of night, intended to appease a dark deity lurking beneath the water. According to her, that deity was hungry, always waiting to be fed with the essence of the living, and it was said that the human teeth, symbols of both sustenance and loss, were left behind as a terrible token of its unholy bargain. As Jeremiah's research deepened, so too did the dread that he felt. Each piece of the puzzle, the missing mouth in his reflection, the whispered name that haunted his dreams, and the morbid teeth embedded in the riverbed, began to coalesce into a singular, horrifying possibility. The river was hungry, not just for water, but for something more, something that fed on the voices, the identities, the very souls of the people who dwelled too close to its banks. It was as if the river sought to reclaim what had been lost in forgotten years, to exact revenge on a world that had scorned its ancient power. One moonless night, compelled by a terror that bordered on despair, Jeremiah returned to the river. The sky was an inky abyss, the only light provided by the dim glow of distant stars. Every step he took along the muddy bank echoed with a dreadful foreboding. His heart pounded with the rhythm of ancient drums, and a cold sweat traced the lines of his weathered face. He knelt at the edge of the flowing water, taking in the awful sight of those embedded teeth one more time. For a long, agonizing moment, he listened to the murmurs of the river, trying to decipher its language of anguish and hunger. Then, in the midst of that oppressive silence, the river spoke again, not in words, but in a vibration deep within his bones. A faint gurgling sound rose from beneath the water, a sound that seemed to echo the relentless drip of a leaky faucet in a desolate room. As he listened, a chill crawled up his spine, and he felt an overwhelming urge to flee. But even as he prepared to stand, a voice, as thin and desperate as a dying whisper, called out, "Jeremiah, return my teeth, return my voice." It was a summons he could not ignore. The voice was neither male nor female, neither human nor beast. It was the sound of something ancient, echoing with sorrow and unyielding malice, begging for what had been taken. The realization struck him with the force of a hammer. The river was not merely a passive element of nature, but a living, malevolent presence, a creature that had once been whole, that had had its own identity, and that now sought to reclaim a vital part of itself that had been lost in the turning of time. The human teeth were not random. They were trophies, remnants of a ritual sacrifice that had doomed the river to an insatiable hunger. As the voice receded into the dark, Jeremiah staggered backward, nearly losing his balance in his desperate flight. The cold, dark water lapped at his ankles like the grasping fingers of specters trying to drag him into the depths. He ran, faster than he had ever run in his life, with a singular, desperate thought: escape. But no matter how far he fled, the nightmares that the river invoked would follow him. Every reflective surface in his path showed a version of his face mutilated into silence, a mouthless mask that silently pleaded for salvation from the curse. Days turned into sleepless nights, and the events at the river became the stuff of local legend. Neighbors avoided the banks at dusk, and the once tranquil flow of the water took on a menacing quality. The townsfolk began to speak in hushed, trembling voices about the day the river lost its voice, and how it sought to reclaim what was rightfully its own. Some claimed that those who had seen their reflections without a mouth were doomed to be the river's next tribute, their voices swallowed and their identities erased forever. Haunted by these events and tormented by a persistent feeling of foreboding, Jeremiah became a recluse. He locked himself in his modest cabin, the windows covered in heavy drapes, trying to avoid any reflection of the accursed river. Yet at night the sound of water dripping over stone would seep through the walls, and in those moments he could almost hear that terrible, inhuman plea. His dreams were no longer his own. They were invaded by images of a gaping maw in the moonlit water, and by ghostly faces missing their voices, forever trapped beneath the surface, silently screaming for their stolen pieces. One particularly dreadful night, when the wind howled like the banshees of lost souls, and the river seemed to boil beneath a sky choked with clouds, Jeremiah felt the call again. This time it was louder and more insistent, a cacophony of whispers that invaded every corner of his mind. The voices seemed to merge into one overwhelming plea: "Return my teeth! Return my voice!" It was as though the river was crying out not just for itself, but for all those it had consumed, a litany of sorrow that promised only one outcome: complete annihilation of the self. Unable to resist any longer, Jeremiah donned his coat and trudged out into the storm. The night was a maelstrom of wind and rain that battered his fragile frame, but his resolve was hardened by desperation. He made his way back to the river, each step feeling heavier than the last, as if the cursed water itself were trying to hold him back. When he reached the bank, he stood before the ceaseless flow of dark water, its surface churning and filled with unspoken terror. There, in the midst of nature's relentless fury, he called out in a voice barely more than a whisper, I will return your teeth. I will give you back your voice." In that moment, the water stilled as if in response. The teeth embedded in the rocks glowed faintly under the intermittent flashes of lightning. Then, as though driven by an unseen force, they began to shift. One by one, the teeth dislodged themselves and floated toward Jeremiah in a macabre ballet. He stood frozen, mesmerized and horrified, as the teeth circled him like a ring of cruel, silent judges. In the swirling chaos of the storm, he caught sight of his reflection once more in the agitated water. His face, once defined by years of hard, honest life, was now grotesque, a mirror of the curse, mouthless and mute, the very essence of his identity nearly erased. The river's voice rose once again, a deep, resonant tone that seemed to originate from the bowels of the earth. "Return my teeth! Return my voice!" The sound vibrated through Jeremiah's bones, a living dirge that left him trembling with the terrible knowledge that he was not simply witnessing a miracle, but fulfilling a dark, ancient pact. With a shuddering gasp, he sank to his knees at the water's edge, gathering the now glimmering teeth in his hands. They were cool and unnervingly heavy, a burden he felt deep in his soul. For hours he sat there, cradling the remnants of a horror that defied explanation. The storm raged around him, and the once placid river took on a rhythmic murmur, as if it were absorbing the very essence of his despair. As dawn neared, a fragile silence replaced the tempest's roar. Jeremiah rose slowly, his mind a chaotic mix of grief, terror, and acceptance. In the pale light of a new day, he understood with a sickening clarity that he had become an unwilling mediator, a living sacrifice to a river that had long since stopped speaking in words and now communicated only in hunger and eerie echoes. When Jeremiah returned to town, he was a changed man, bearing the scars of that night, as well as a mysterious void where his voice should have been. The townsfolk regarded him with a mixture of pity and dread. His eyes, once warm with the assurance of a simple life, now haunted every reflection with an emptiness reminiscent of the cursed river. And though he never spoke of that terrible night, the silence that clung to him was unmistakable, a silent testament to the price of meddling with forces beyond human ken. In the days, weeks, and years that followed, the legend of the river and its stolen teeth seeped into the very soul of Ashmere. Parents would hush their children with cautionary tales of a river that devoured voices and a man who lost his own in the process. The water itself became an object of dread and whispered invocations. Even the simplest act of staring into its murky depths now carried the risk of being ensnared by that ancient curse. And whenever the weather turned foul or an eerie calm settled over the land, neighbors would glance nervously toward the river, as if expecting it to call out their names in that same mournful tone, demanding the return of what had once been taken. Though Jeremiah eventually faded from public memory, his existence reduced to quiet murmurs in taverns and half-remembered folk songs, the cursed phenomenon persisted. The river, now a permanent scar upon the landscape, continued its slow, unhurried flow. Its rocky bed still bore the remnants of those long-forgotten teeth, and for those few brave enough to cast a sideways glance at its surface, there remained an echo, a silent plea of unspeakable hunger. And so it is that the tale of the teeth in the river endures, a story of loss, of curses woven into the fabric of nature, and of a quiet horror that claims not only the voice, but the very soul of anyone who dares meet its gaze. In the depths of every foggy morning or storm-tossed night, when the river whispers in a language older than time, listen carefully, for if you hear your own name called in a silent, desperate murmur, it may be the cursed water demanding that you return what it claims as its own. Ashmere stands as a bleak reminder that some forces of nature are not meant to be understood, and some curses are too ancient to be undone. As the river flows on, a dark, endless artery beneath a sky that sometimes weeps a blood-red light, Its legend grows ever more macabre, and the echoes of its terrible hunger follow those who dare to dream, ensuring that even in the light of day, the shadow of the forgotten curse lingers on, waiting for its next victim. In the end, no matter how far you run, no matter how hard you try to outrun the terror of what lies beneath the rippled surface, the river will always call out to you, a silent siren in the darkness. And as you peer into its depths, beware the void where your reflection should be, because in that gap there might just be something reaching out to claim you, to steal your voice along with the rest of your soul, leaving you as empty and mute as the man who once returned to teeth and lost everything to the hungry water. Thank you for listening to this week's story, and I hope you'll join us next week as we bring you more great classic tales on Friday Night Frights. And until then, have a great week, everyone.